Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar here. We're going to be getting started here in a couple of minutes. So it's 1:58 Eastern time. So we'll get started right around 2 o'clock. I might give folks till 2:01 to get here to join us. But go ahead and get settled down, get yourself a cup of coffee, turn your speakers up, and we're going to walk through working with Angular and NgRx. Our webinar today will start here in about 30 seconds. Us now joining us, we're going to start here right at 1 after the hour. In a couple of seconds. It's 2:01 after the hour. We'll go ahead and get this webinar started here talking about Angular with NgRx. My name is Eric Green. I am a programmer and technical trainer. I travel all over the world teaching students how to build Angular applications, with NgRx. I also teach a lot of other topics. I teach things like React, just JavaScript, CSS, HTML in general. And I also do a fair amount of .NET Core related training. But in this particular webinar, we're going to take a look at exploring the essentials of NgRx. Before we dive into the actual content of the webinar, I just want to mention a couple of things here about Wintellect, who is sponsoring this webinar. Wintellect's business really centers around 3 different areas. They do a lot of consulting, especially in the Azure cloud, especially with .NET and other Microsoft technologies. If you're looking for any type of consulting about how to build your application, or you actually need someone to build your application, Wintellect is a great resource to reach out to be able to do that. Another thing they do is they do instructor-led training. So they'll send people like myself out to your customer location and teach classes on a variety of topics, a variety of Microsoft topics, web programming topics, cloud computing topics, so on and so forth. In fact, their big claim to fame is that they're Microsoft's #1 training vendor, and they've trained more than 50,000 Microsoft developers. That's a lot of people to train. The third part of their business is the on-demand training through their subscription-based videos. I actually create a lot of videos for them on a whole wide variety of topics, everything from JavaScript related things to client-side UI to some back-end stuff with .NET Core, as well as some things on Python and SQL and a little bit of machine learning. We have those topics and a whole bunch more all provided as part of Wintellect now. Maybe at the end of this particular presentation, if you want, you can head over to wintellectnow.com and check out the many courses that they have available out there for you to use to enhance your learning on a wide variety of topics. In addition to those core things, Wintellect also contributes a lot to the community. And one of the ways they contribute is through the actual publication of books. In fact, they kind of say, hey, we wrote the book. They've written over 30 of them on a whole wide variety of topics, mostly centered around Microsoft stuff, but a whole wide variety of topics, contributing back to the community, the wealth of knowledge and experience they have on all of these different areas. In fact, many of you here have probably purchased one of their books before, one of the books their people have written, and not even realize they actually wrote it. And it's just a tremendous resource, and it's a great way to give back to others to be able to make use of this knowledge and this experience they've accumulated over the years. Now, they do have some special offers. If you're attending the webinar here and you would like to get some discounts on some training, they're offering a 10% discount on any public virtual mock courses, so Microsoft official courses. A 10% discount on Microsoft certification roles training. Also, App Dev Cloud, a free briefing or QA. You can discuss with them a bunch of different topics you might have or questions you have on the Azure cloud, DevOps, data, and AI, modern web development, so on and so forth. That in and of itself, just to get a bunch of questions answered, is an incredible value. And then finally, offering a 10% discount on private on-site training. So that's where an actual instructor comes out to your location and then teaches a class for your group of people. It could be just for a general group of people from your company, or it could be a specific team of people who are trying to get ramped up on some type of programming technology to start building your company's next generation of solutions. If you want to find out more information on this, what you'll want to do is reach out to Martha Guerin, and here's her email. It's mguerin@wintellect.com, and you can reach out to her after this presentation is over, and she can see about helping you take advantage of some of these special offers for the ones that make sense for your business. Now, getting into the actual content here today, we're going to be taking a look at using NgRx to basically upgrade an initial or an existing Angular application to use NgRx. So as you know, Angular itself is a full-blown framework. You don't have to use NgRx. But what we're going to do is take an existing app and show you how to upgrade it to use NgRx and talk about some of the benefits that go along with doing that. Yes, it's another API you have to learn, but it's an API that can be incredibly beneficial for allowing you to build better applications. As part of this discussion, we're going to talk about the basics of NgRx, which is going to include a little bit of a discussion about the Redux itself and the larger Redux pattern. We're then going to dive into talking about actions, reducers, and selectors, specifically how the coding of that is done. One of the things that happened actually earlier this year, back in April, was a new version of NgRx was released that has a new API. So for some of you who maybe have been using NgRx for a while, you may not be aware that there's actually some newer APIs for doing things like creating actions and reducers, so on and so forth. So you'll definitely want to pay attention to that part when we get to how to use those newer APIs. We'll briefly talk about the Redux developer tools, just kind of show you how you would incorporate that into your Angular NgRx application. Then we're going to take a look at how to set up our REST API calls using effects. So the original Angular application that we're going to be upgrading, it actually does use a REST service, and we're going to upgrade it in basically really two steps. The first step is we're going to upgrade it to use NgRx and then just manage the data kind of in memory within the application. Then we're going to do a second upgrade process and actually have it use effects so that once again it can talk to the REST API. We have a third version of the application, which we're not going to be coding in the webinar, but I've already pre-coded ahead of time. And that third version is going to demonstrate how to do things like working with features and lazy loading of feature stores, so on and so forth. And then finally, as part of that third application, we'll just briefly talk about connecting the Angular router to NgRx and kind of what entails making that happen. So Angular itself is a very popular JavaScript based UI framework. Yes, I know we actually write our Angular code in TypeScript, but ultimately all TypeScript is transpiled to JavaScript. So just like other libraries and frameworks like React or Vue, Angular is used to build your actual UI framework within your web browser environment. One of the things that Angular does not have an opinion on is how to manage application state. While Angular is opinionated about a lot of things, when it comes to managing application state, Angular doesn't really have an opinion on how is the best way to do that. That's where NgRx comes into the picture. NgRx is going to provide us a very well-structured, organized way to manage the application state in our Angular library. And the way it's going to do this is it's actually going to pull in the principles and ideas of Redux, which is cool, but it's also going to leverage the fact that our Angular applications use RxJS. So anybody who's worked with Angular for any length of time quickly realizes that the way that we look at asynchronous operations and the APIs that we use to manage those asynchronous operations is a little bit different. We're not using things like the fetch API and promises and stuff like that. Instead, we're using observables, and we're thinking of things in terms of RxJS. Well, what NgRx is going to do is going to allow us to bring together Redux and RxJS together. And what you start to realize is that things like processing actions or pulling data out of the state over time, those things are actually perfect candidates for working with observables. And so we'll take a look at that in terms of working with Angular and NgRx together in our little demonstration application. Now, while NgRx is a great addition, it can be a little bit difficult to learn. In fact, it's a little bit more difficult to learn than even just doing React with Redux or something like that, because not only do you have to know the RxJS part, so you have to go a little bit deeper with that, but you also have to learn the Redux part. And so Redux itself can be difficult for students to grab at first, and RxJS can be a little difficult as well. And so the thing though is, I always tell people that things like Redux are only hard because they're new. They're not really hard because they're hard. And so with a little bit of practice and a little bit of preparation, you can easily master things like Redux and RxJS and combine them together in NgRx, and then have a great way to actually manage state in your application. So in this particular webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to configure NgRx, how to set up those actions, reducers, and selectors, the Redux dev tools, the REST API calls, and then connecting that routing to NgRx. Now, this diagram right here, I got this diagram from the NgRx website. I actually thought it was an excellent diagram. I was like, well, I could redraw my own, but this is actually perfect. This diagram represents the flow of logic and data inside of your NgRx application. What I want to do is, as we go through the coding of this, I'm going to come back to this slide a couple of times, and I want to point out to you where we are in this process of putting this together. One of the things you're going to learn in modern UI programming, and it's really true of programming in general, but I think it's especially true of modern UI programming. When we write our code, it's really not about trying to implement what we think is maybe a good way to do something. A lot of times we don't have the full breadth of experience and knowledge that the entire community has. Instead, what we want to do is we want to try to learn those best practices and patterns that have proven themselves over time. And then when we write our code, try to follow those best practices and patterns. So once we've mastered those, then of course we can innovate and improve and look for ways to tweak and make things better. But we really want to make sure we understand the pattern, not just learn the specific API like NgRx, but understand why this pattern is good, and then how NgRx is going to be fulfilling that pattern. That way, as you're working with your code over time, even when NgRx goes through a slight API change, like it did earlier this year, you'll still understand why all the parts and pieces are there to tie all of that together. So before we actually dive into the code, let me just kind of quickly walk you through this diagram at a very high level, and then we'll walk through the coding process of kind of pulling all this together. If you've worked with Angular before, you're most likely very familiar with what an Angular component is. It's really nothing more than just an HTML template. There's usually some data, maybe some event handlers associated with that template, but all of that is kind of combined together, and it presents something on the screen that allows people to see stuff as well as to interact with it. The question though is, where does application state fit in? Application state is generally the overall set of data that impacts what you see on the screen. So application state could be the actual data that you think of as data, like in our case, it's going to be a table of cars. But the application state could also include things like which column you're sorting on or which page you're looking at. While this information can be stored inside of a React, or not a React, but an Angular component, it could even be stored throughout the component tree. A lot of times when you're storing it throughout the tree or storing it in a component, you end up running into a problem where data and state starts becoming inconsistent. So one of the goals of something like Redux, and ultimately NgRx in this case, is to pull that application state out of the component tree and manage it external to the component tree, and then ultimately pass that data into the component tree, which can then be responsible for rendering it. So what you see here in our diagram is you see we have this component in the bottom left-hand corner. And then towards the middle of the diagram at the top, you're going to see we have the store. The component is where we're going to be rendering out the information, but the store is where we're going to actually be storing the information, storing the application state. So what we need to do is we need to have a way to efficiently and effectively connect our component to our store. How are we going to do that? Well, if you think about it, most UI changes, or actually all UI changes, are always the result of something changing something. A lot of times that something is a person interacting with it. So for example, a person clicks a button, or a person interacts with a form field, or a person clicks a link, or something along those lines. When a person does that, or anything, it doesn't have to be a person, we create what's called an action. The action could be save the car, delete the car, edit the car, what have you. Well, that action then needs to be applied to our state to produce a new state saying, okay, here's the car that I saved, now save it. Here's the row that I want to edit, so now show that row in edit mode by tracking the ID of the car that I want to edit. To apply that data from the action to the state, we use what's called a reducer. So you'll see here in our diagram, we go from having a component that generates an action that is then applied to a reducer that produces a new application state. Well, once that new application state is produced, we then want to select the parts of the state that we're interested in and pass that selected information into the component. The role of selecting the data from the state and passing it into the component, that's the role of the selector. So you kind of see this unidirectional flow going on here. So we have our component, the user interacts with it, produces an action. That action is then used to produce new application state inside the store using a reducer. With the new application state inside the store, we have a selector which selects that and then ultimately is used to re-render the component with the new information. And that's that unidirectional pattern that you see in Redux. Now, where does the NgRx process fit in here? Where the NgRx process is going to fit in is going to be basically the pipelining. If you picture the path going from the component to the store, that's like a little pipeline. And if you look at the path from the store to the component, that's like a little pipeline. Data changes over time. That's where the RxJS part of this is going to be fitting in. Now, the last piece I want to mention on this diagram before we jump into our code is if you look over here at our diagram, you'll see we have this thing called effects. And then there's this like database REST service thing here at the top of the right-hand side. The effects is how we manage basically what you might think of as asynchronous operations. So if we need to make a call to a REST service or something like that, we have to kind of manage that external to the square that you see over on the left. And then what ends up happening is when you're working with your effects, it actually causes additional actions to be produced that can then be processed inside of the component store square that you see there. So as part of this, we're going to be using RxJS to also manage these effects. Okay, so with that little bit of an overview there, let's dive into the code, and then I'm going to come back to this diagram from time to time where we can kind of relate the code that we're writing back to the diagram itself. So over here, I've got a car tool app demo project. Just so you can kind of see here, I actually have other folders here that actually have completed versions of these. And so what'll happen later on is when this webinar is over, we'll actually push all of this code up to a GitHub repository, and you'll get a link to it as part of the follow-up email from the webinar. So everything that you're going to see me demo here, you can go and download in the future after the webinar is over, and we'll take care of that really as quickly as possible. So that code will be available to you. So as you're going through the webinar, don't feel the need to try to code along or anything like that. You can grab this code a little bit later on. But here inside my car tool app demo, I have my starting car tool program here. And if I come in here and say npm start, we'll fire up this application here real quick. Give it a second to run. And it's processing. Cool. Okay, so I want to grab the web browser here. Let's drag that window there. Move that one down a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to reload my page here, and you'll see I have this little car tool app. It doesn't really have any styling or anything like that applied to this. When you're doing the NgRx stuff, it really has nothing to do with CSS. This is all about managing data within the actual application itself. So I wanted to keep everything as simple and as focused as possible. So if you take a look here, I have this very simple car tool app. I can come into here and I can add cars. So there's my car. I can delete cars. I can edit cars, so on and so forth. Okay. So this application is just a standard regular Angular application. If you come into my source folder, you'll see there's a folder called car tool. If you come into here, you'll see a variety of components that are being used to display the car form, the car home, the car table, the various rows. If you look in here, there's a service for interacting with car data. For the REST service for this application, I'm actually using something called JSON server. And this is the DB.json file that's powering the data for the JSON server. Whenever you see me add data or change data or delete data, those changes are being reflected in this DB.json file. So if you never heard of JSON server before, JSON server is a great tool for basically setting up a very simple REST service that you can interact with as part of building a UI application. Okay, so now that we understand the basic architecture, what we want to do is we want to set this thing up to actually use NgRx to manage our application state. So to get started with that, I need to install a couple of packages. Now, because we're going to be working with a lot of code here in the next 35 minutes or so, I have actually pre-coded the steps for this, and I'm going to be copying and pasting code into the window. Ordinarily, I do everything with live coding, but because of the amount of code we're going to be working with here, there's just not going to be enough time to watch me do all the keystrokes. So anyways, let's go ahead and do the first step, which is going to be installing some packages that we're going to need. So in order to get started with NgRx, we're going to need to install the store package. This is what's going to be providing us the basic functionality for creating actions, setting up reducers, registering those reducers with the store, being able to do selectors, so on and so forth. The next thing that we're going to need to set up are the dev tools. The dev tools package will allow us to use the Redux dev tools with our application, which is actually really nice and makes things easier to work with. Over here, we have our effects. The effects we'll be using later on in the webinar. That's what's going to be managing the asynchronous operations. And then the router store package will allow us to connect our Angular router to our actual store for NgRx. So we'll go ahead and install those here real quick. Okay, great. Those packages are installed. Let's go ahead and get started building the application. The first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to define the actual structure of our application state. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a file here called appstate.ts, and we're going to create that right here inside of our app folder. There we go. And then for the content of that file, we're simply just going to be defining our application state. So this is really going to be nothing more than an interface. If you take a look here at our app state, we have the array of cars. That's what you saw on the table. And then the other piece of application state that I needed was the actual edit car ID. So which car am I editing when I click edit here on the table itself? Other than that, we're actually good on application state. So that'll be the information that we're going to be managing with Redux. Now, our next step is we need to define the actions in our application. If you take a look at the code over here, we had the ability to add a car, edit a car, delete a car. We could also save and cancel. So we'll have to define all of those actions in order to be able to handle those with our NgRx stuff. So here inside of car tool, I'm going to create a new file called car actions.ts. And inside of that file, I'm going to move this down here a little bit. I'm going to put this code here. So what's this code doing for us? This is actually utilizing the new Create Action API, which came out last April. And this allows me to basically ultimately define a function that will produce the desired action object. That function will also have a property on it called type that I can use to reference which type this is. Now, if you look at the Create Action API here, you'll see that I'm specifying two arguments. The first argument being passed in is the actual name of the action. For each of your actions in your system, it should have a unique name. You'll also see that I'm basically scoping my action to things that are related to a car. For a very large application, you could have many sets of actions impacting different parts of the application, and you might have different values inside of the square braces. Now, the square braces are not required. That's just a convention used to help organize our actions. The second argument that you see here is I'm defining the actual type of the data defined on my action. So here my action is going to have a car property for the append and replace, but for the delete and the edit, I'm just going to simply have to pass in the car ID. And then for the actual cancel itself, I don't need anything. I just need to set the edit car ID back to -1. So these are the various actions. You will have to create an action for every single action in your system. And for a large application, it can be a lot of actions, that's for sure. Now, our next step is we need to set up the reducers. So if we come back over to our diagram here, if we come back over to our diagram, you'll see we have our actions, but now we need to create the reducers that those actions are going to be passed into. To do that, we're going to create a new file here called car.reducers.ts. So we'll come into here and we'll say new file, pass that in like that. There's our car reducers. And then let me grab the code for this. One nice thing about this new API that we're working with that came out in April is it does make the overall code shorter. I've done this same demonstration before with the older API, and the code to make it all happen was significantly longer and actually a little bit more complicated, especially on the TypeScript side. But this right here really makes things a lot shorter. So in this new version, to create our reducer, we're going to use a create reducer function. Now the reducer basically receives two things. It receives the state and it receives the action. And what happens is the reducer applies the action to the state to produce a new state. That new state is what is then stored inside of the NgRx store and then is ultimately used to update the UI. In this particular application, we had several ways in which we were interacting with our car data. For example, I could add a car, I could replace a car, or I could delete a car. I also had the ability to specify whether or not I was editing a car. So you'll notice inside of each of these functions, I have some logic, which is making use of the action, making use of the state. And the goal is to produce a new value for the state, which gets returned from the function. Now, there is something very important you have to be aware of. All of the code that you use inside of these functions must work with the objects immutably. You cannot mutate the state. You have to produce a new state. That's why you see me doing things here like spreading out my action.car into, spreading out my action.car into a new object and then setting the ID property here. You'll also notice that I'm using state.concat, not state.push. And that's because any of the parameters passed into these functions must be treated immutably. So you always have to produce a new object. This is fundamental, not just to NgRx, but it's fundamental to Redux, because in Redux, your reducer functions are always pure functions. So here's our reducers. So now that we've got our reducer set up, now we need to actually set up the store. So coming back over here to our diagram, I need to set up the actual store here. That's going to be housing the state and housing the reducers. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to open up app module TS here. And then inside of app module TS, we're going to be doing some additional imports. And what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to pull in the store module from NgRx. So because we're working with Angular, we're using the Angular structures for tying this together. And the way that NgRx makes the store available to us as an actual module, and then inside of that module are some registered services that you can work with. We also need to pull in a reference to our reducers because we'll use that when setting up the store. So now down here, let's go ahead and set up the store module within the imports of our app module. So you can see here, I'm using store module, I'm using the for root pattern. So this will basically set up the services at the root of the application. This will become important later on when we have feature modules, feature modules. And the feature modules, we want to register new reducers and stuff, but we don't want to re-register any store services. And then here we're setting up our cars and our edit car ID, okay, using these reducers there. So whenever we're doing anything with the cars property of our state, that'll use the cars reducer. When I'm using the edit car ID property on my state, it'll run it through the edit car ID reducer. And of course, both of those were imported from our reducers file. So now at this point in our coding, we now have our store. Our last step now is we need to actually set up the selector, which will grab data from the store and populate the component with it. So for this next step, what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our car home component. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, I'll mention it now. The way car home is set up is that car home is the parent component of the tool header, the car table, and the car form that you saw over in the web browser. So everything flows through car home. In a sense, you could almost, if you're familiar with Redux and some of the patterns used with Redux, you could almost think of the car home as almost like a container component. So the car home itself doesn't really do any UI stuff. It mostly just references other UI components. And then inside of it, it's got some logic tying those things together. So what we're going to do now is we're going to upgrade this to now use our store. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take our actual store here, and we're going to add that to our list of imports. So we have our store, and this select API is how we create the selector that was mentioned on the diagram. Then I'm going to bring in my app state, my car model. There we go. So this is going to bring in my actual app state type. This will bring in my car model that I'm using. We were already importing that. And then these are all the various actions that I had set up as part of my application. The next step is we need to replace the logic down here in car home component with the logic that actually works with NgRx. So I'm going to grab some code here, and we'll just come over to here and we'll delete this. I will also be including the original application as part of the code for this, so you can always go back and take a look at that as well. Okay, so now we have our class car home component. We have this implements on init, but right now we're not actually even using on init in here, so I'll just go ahead and take that off. We were using the on init to refresh from the REST service, but this first version that I'm doing doesn't actually call the REST service yet. Okay, so now we've got our selector here, which is selecting data off of the store. You can see we have RxJS being used here, like I mentioned before. This is one of the places where RxJS comes in terms of selecting. Because we're setting these up as observable streams, we have the $ here used at the end. That's really just a convention, not a requirement, but it's a way of denoting that that's an actual observable stream. If you come over to car home component, what we're going to do is we're going to upgrade our template to use these observable streams for passing in the cars and the edit car ID. So notice I'm doing the async here on the outside of car table. That way I don't have to modify car table to work with observables. It will still continue to receive the array as it normally does, the edit car ID as it normally does, so on and so forth. But this allows me then to hook into that data that I selected off of my store. So now if I come back over to here, I should have all my pieces. The last thing I want to mention is this dispatching of the action. So if you come back to our diagram and I select the data now, which is then populating the component, when our user comes back and interacts with this component, then it generates a new action. That is what's happening here. When we go into our car home and we start doing the edit car and delete car and save car on car table, that is then going to trigger these functions, which then distribute a new action. So at this point, we now have gone full circle. Our component can dispatch actions. Those actions can be applied to the state using the reducer, which updates the store. And then the selector makes use of the store to populate what you see in the component. So with that said, let's go ahead now and fire up the application again. Make sure we don't have any bugs or typos or anything like that. All right, it's building. Okay, looks like everything compiled successfully. If we come back over to here, even though I did do the reload, I'm going to just reload the page just for demo purposes. So now we'll come into here. I'll go ahead and say add a car, just type in some fake data. Click add car, our car got added. I can delete the car, so on and so forth. Click edit, cancel. So you can see now our application is working using Redux. Well, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do we know it's actually using NgRx? How can we see that NgRx is actually being used here? And the way that we can do that is by actually turning on those dev tools that we installed a little earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close a couple of these files. So I'm going to come back over here to app module. And what I'm going to do is at the top of this, I'm going to import my dev tools. Then what I'm going to do is come down here and I'm going to turn on the instrumentation. Now there are a number of options that you can pass into this, like the max age of the state changes you want to save and stuff like that, but we're just going to go with just the default here. So now if you take a look, our application's up and running. I'm going to come into here and I'm going to click on more tools, and then I'm going to click on developer tools here. And I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to select Redux. There we go. And so now with my Redux dev tools, you can see that initialization action starting off. By the way, before I actually even walk you through this, if you don't have the Redux dev tools installed, you can install those by going to more tools, extensions. And then if you come over here and click on the little sandwich menu, you can click on Open Chrome Web Store, and that will open up the web store. And if you type in Redux in the search here, you can get the Redux dev tools. I should mention that first. So I did that, prior to this so that I would have the dev tools available to do my Redux debugging. Now back over here to CarTool. Now watch what happens when I interact with CarTool now. You can see I have a new action called append car. And I can click on that and I can see the actual data for the action. I can see the state as a result of running that action. I can also see a diff between the state before and after. Okay, so now I've got this extra car added to the state. That's the diff. We can come into here. I could say edit, increment, click save. You see more actions coming through. But here's the really cool part, is the time traveling. I can come into here and I can actually go backwards in time. See how that works? It's actually going back to the previous states. This only works because of two reasons. Number one, you do not mutate the state. If you mutate the state, the old state tree won't be available for viewing the earlier state of the application. The second thing is that all of your application state must be stored in NgRx. This is actually one of the most difficult things for students to fully grasp, is the idea that if you're going to use Redux, NgRx, whatever, if you really want to experience the real, true, full benefit of it, if you really want to be able to make use of these developer tools, you must store all of the application state in Redux and NgRx, what have you. If you do not, then when you go back to previous states, you won't get necessarily the exact same UI that you showed previously, because you will be missing some of the state information. So the thing is, you can not put it all there, and that's fine, and your application will work. But then when you try to view previous versions of that state, you're not really going to necessarily be seeing what reality was or what reality is. That goes back to what I was saying before. When we write our code, it's not about getting it to work. It's not about me just figuring out the API well enough to make something look like it's working on the screen. To do this modern UI programming, to use things like an NgRx, Redux, what have you, you really have to learn the pattern and learn the rules and embrace it and follow it, because it's something that you'll have to impose as a discipline on yourself, because the tooling won't make you do it. It just will benefit you if you do it. And that's something you want to think about as you're getting into this. A lot of times developers maybe aren't fully familiar with which array API operations mutate the array, how do you work immutably with objects. Those are all critical things. So a lot of times when folks are getting into NgRx, the major stumbling block is not the NgRx, it's actually the JavaScript. It's understanding how memory works in JavaScript, how things are properly handled in JavaScript to facilitate these various patterns and to follow their rules. So that's something you want to think about when you jump into this, is making sure you're familiar with that. Also, I highly recommend, in addition to reading the NgRx documentation, you should really head over to the Redux documentation and read some of the documents surrounding the big ideas behind how Redux works. That can be incredibly helpful too, and really helping to solidify your understanding of what's going on. So with that said, let's go ahead now and jump into connecting this back up to our REST service. Right now, everything we're doing is totally within memory. If I were to reload this page, you'll see it all goes back to what it was before. So in order to get into the side effects part of this, talking to the REST service, we're going to have to incorporate effects. Now, the effects are provided to us through an additional module that's provided as part of the larger NgRx library of code. And that effects module is where we can define our various asynchronous operations, such as making a REST service call. The thing though is that we're going to have to make a few more changes other than just incorporating the REST service calls. We're going to have to rethink our actions. You see, the way that an action typically works is that an action, in a general sense, is tied to a single task that gets executed in JavaScript. But as you know from asynchronous operations, you always have two tasks. You have the first task, which is requested, and then you have a second task, which then executes in the future once the system has finished processing whatever you've requested, in this case, an AJAX call. So because an action is generally tied to a JavaScript task, asynchronous operations have two JavaScript tasks, you need two actions. Now, as we go to create this, you'll see that some of my asynchronous operations have two actions. A couple of them only have one. But that's only because once I perform the first one, I'm then performing a second asynchronous operation, which then has two specific actions. But you'll see what I'm talking about when we jump into this. So what we're going to do is we're going to now upgrade this to do these asynchronous operations. So up here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come into car tool. I'm going to open up actions, and I'm going to replace these actions with my asynchronous ones. And yes, I will be providing a copy of each of these stages. So you'll get a copy with the first stage without the asynchronous, a copy with the asynchronous, and then a copy with our final one that we're gonna take a look at here in a second. So there's our actions. You'll see I've got a refresh cars that actually pulls the data down from the REST service. For that, I have two actions set up, one for the request and one for the done. The append, replace, and delete each only have the request. In a real application, I typically always do a request and a done for both. But in this application, the way that I've set it up is that when you go to add a car, we're then going to trigger a refresh immediately after that. When you go to replace a car, we're going to trigger a refresh. Since we're already doing an asynchronous operation and the user's already waiting for that to finish, it's usually a pretty good time to go ahead and refresh our data as well. So that's why you only see the one for the request. You'll see we still have edit and cancel, and those don't have a request and done because those are not asynchronous. So you'll have a combination of synchronous tasks or synchronous actions and asynchronous actions. So the next step is we need to actually add a new file called car.effects. And this will have all of our effects defined for our car tool application here. So I'll create a new file called car.effects. There we go. And then for this one, let me grab some code here. This is going to be incorporating our asynchronous operations for actually making a call to our REST service, so on and so forth. As part of this, I'll be using the actual car service that we had used earlier when talking to the REST service. So you'll see me using a car service that's already been pre-created. So we'll go ahead and pass that in there like that and set that up. So if you take a look at this code here, what we've done is created a new service called car effects. In this service, we have some effects set up. You'll notice, unlike the old API, which used a decorator to set up the effect, we're now using this create effect function. And as part of this, we're using RxJS to hook into the actions pipeline to then manage our asynchronous operation. So for example, when we get an action that is a refresh cars request, then we want to trigger a call to the service to get all the car data. Then we want to take that car data and do a refresh cars done action. That's the second action for the asynchronous. But if you look at the append here, you'll notice that I'm doing the append and the replace and the delete, but then after I do those, I'm immediately triggering that refresh cars request, which then of course causes this code up here to actually execute. So you'll see how I'm doing that refresh automatically. So now that we've got our effects in place, our next step is we need to register this with our actual module. So coming back down here to app module TS, we're going to pull in some additional code here. We're going to pull in the actual effects module, and we'll pull in the car effects that we've set up. As part of that, we'll need to actually register the effects module with our app module. There we go. So there's our effects module. The next step is we need to then update the reducers. The reducers will actually be a lot simpler in this case because now the reducers are no longer responsible for actually doing the adding to an array and stuff like that. It's really just responsible for handling the cars and stuff that come back from the service. So we're going to upgrade our reducers to look like this. So now our car reducer became really simple. On the refresh cars done action, it simply just takes whatever cars are passed back and returns those to update the state. The edit car ID reducer is a little bit simpler too. We still have edit and cancel, but now whenever we have refresh cars done, we'll go ahead and set the edit ID to -1. So we'll go ahead and save that. Now, the last piece we have to do is we have to make our way back over to the component and update some things over there to make that work. So we'll come over here to our car home TS file, and we're going to upgrade our actions import to now use these actions here. And then we're going to upgrade our component here to do our operations, but using these new actions. There we go. So now we have our new actions in place. So now if we come back over to here, I'm going to reload. I don't really have to, but I'll reload. And you'll see now I've got my refresh cars request and my refresh cars done. There's those two actions. So now I'll come into here. I'll go ahead and add another car, click add, and there's our car. And if I refresh this, the car should still be there because now it's being stored. And our db.json file, just for fun here, should be updated to have that new car added to it. And then of course, if I say delete, it goes away, boom. But what you'll notice is that here we have our, let's see if they'll give me my little arrow there. Well, never mind. So you'll see we have our actions here, our request, our done, our delete, our refresh. You can see all of those coming through. For example, when the initial refresh cars request comes through, you'll see we don't have any cars. But then with the refresh cars done, now we have cars. And you can actually go all the way back to the beginning here and you can see what it looks like as we do the various actions. Pretty cool. So there's an example of upgrading that application to now use REST services. We had to incorporate the effects module and then define our asynchronous operations to make that happen. The last thing I want to talk about here, and then we'll open it up to questions, is I want to show you how to basically divide your application into ultimately multiple modules, with each module having a set of features and then lazily loading those features into the actual store. And by features, we really are talking about reducers that produce a state tree. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this one. And I've got this one. There we go. Fire that up. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in the browser first. Whoops. Is it still compiling? Give it a second here. Okay, so this is a very, very simple, much more simple version than the previous, except this one's actually divided up into multiple modules that will lazily load features. For example, right now you're looking at the table, but if I click on car view 1, it then shows me car view 1. You'll see we had a route change up here. If I click back, click on view here, so on and so forth. If I say return to table, click refresh. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reload this. And I'm going to drag this down here a little bit like that. Now, take a look at this here real quick. On this initial load, if you come into the state, you will see there's a router, there's an error message, and then there's the car table, right? Well, watch what happens when I click view. You'll now see there's now a car view here. You'll also notice that it ran update reducers. What happened was when I navigated to this route, not only did it lazily load my Angular module, it also lazily loaded my features for my NgRx store. So what does the code look like that actually makes that happen? So if we come in here to our features and we come down to our app routing, you will see where I am loading my car tool app module, right? So if we come into car tool app and we go to routing for that, you'll see that once again, I'm lazily loading the child modules for these pieces. Well, inside of these child modules, so for example, we'll go to car table. Inside of here, you'll actually see where I have my car table reducer, but then as part of my car table module, I'm actually doing my store module for feature car table. There's also an effects module for feature. So what I'm doing is I'm defining my reducers and my effects in these lazily loaded modules, but I only want one store service. So there's one store service in the actual app module. And then when I navigate to these routes, the code for those routes gets lazily loaded into the Angular app, which also sets up the feature or sets up the reducers and the effects for that particular feature. So in a large application, you don't have to load up 10,000 reducers on the initial page load. You can load up the different parts of your NgRx application as the user is navigating the system. Remember, the NgRx store is not a database. It represents the data necessary to render the UI. A lot of people will somehow start to think of the NgRx store as like a database. They have to have all their information in there all the time. But in reality, the NgRx store is nothing more than the minimal amount of data needed to render the UI. And so you don't need to load up reducers for parts of the UI that the user never goes to visit. And so you can divide this up into these multiple pieces. The last thing I'll mention here real quick is the car tool app module. Last thing I'll mention here is you'll see where I've got the store router connecting module. Now this is a little bit of a controversial thing. Some people believe your routing information should not be in the store. Some people believe that it should. I view the router as state, and since I believe all state should be in the store, I put it in the store. But there's a lot of people who choose not to do that for various reasons. But the idea is if you connect the router into the state on the store, you can access all of that information. You can also access actions that are dispatched by the routing module, which can be useful in terms of handling things related to routing. Okay, so that kind of concludes all the information that I wanted to present here. If you have any questions, feel free to enter those questions into the question box, and we'll hang around here for a couple of minutes and be happy to take any questions that you have related to NgRx, Angular, JavaScript. If you have any questions related to Wintellect and the various services they provide, we'd be more than happy to answer them. Do we have any questions? Can you use the old API with the new API? The answer to that question is yes. You can still use the old API. So if you were previously still setting up classes to define your actions, if you're still using the effects decorator, all of that will still work in the new NgRx. So when you upgrade to the new NgRx, everything should still work fine with your existing application. It should be an incremental upgrade to be incorporating these new APIs. So I know a lot of people have been using NgRx for a long time, and whenever you get a new API, that can always be frustrating because you've already mastered one and you've used it all over the place. How easy is it to upgrade? And my experience has been that the upgrade is very, very easy to do, and it still provides backward compatibility for the old approach. All right, for our next question here. Do we need to create NgRx files per entity? So we have to be careful about thinking about our UI data in terms of our database or server side data. Take, for example, cars. Yes, I have a car on the server. Yes, I have a car on the UI. They are similar in a simple application. But in large applications, many times our UI objects can be combinations or subsets of our actual entities that you would think of in terms of something on the server. You always want to make sure you design database stuff that's best for the database, your business logic for what's best for the business logic, and then ultimately your UI stuff for what is best for the UI. In the case of the UI, our objects should reflect what we're looking at on the screen. And that could mean combining several different types of objects from the server into a single object for the UI, or just using parts of those objects for objects in the UI. So do we set up NgRx per entity? Not really. We really set up our NgRx based upon the structure of the UI itself. So for example, let's say you had an airline website. There's 3 basic operations that every airline website does. You can either buy a ticket, check in for a flight, or you can manage your frequent flyer account. Your NgRx, like setting up your features, would be centered around those 3 workflows, not necessarily the data objects inside of those, not necessarily the data objects used inside of those workflows. So as you, for example, are buying an airline ticket and you go from screen to screen to screen to screen to screen for buying that airline ticket, you're building your state tree based upon those based upon what you're seeing in the UI, not based upon what your database tables look like for the data being used on those screens. All right, next question. Video code, yes. So the video and code samples, you will be sent a link to those. So Wintellect will publish this up on their website, and they'll send a follow-up email. And then from that website, you'll be able to go and watch the video and pull down the code. Give us a little bit of time after the webinar is over to make that happen. Don't try heading over to the Wintellect site immediately when this is over. Once the webinar is over, later on today, I will push that code up, and then you can go there and reference it, and then reach out to us if you have any questions on anything regarding it, or if you'd like to do training on NgRx, what have you. Let's see here. If I have an app which calculates and displays a large amount of tabular data on the dashboard in multiple grids as a requirement. Okay, so if you're working with a large table of data, the bigger issue you're probably going to have is finding the right UI component to use to display that. NgRx itself doesn't really say anything about the UI component. The UI component that you choose might have the ability to let you load all the data into that and then be able to render all that out, or maybe it will only want chunks of that data. If you take a look at different data table solutions out there, you'll actually find a variety of ways in which these tools either handle large amounts of data or they promote how fast they are with large amounts of data. What you're really focused with on the NgRx side is whatever amount of data your data table, your grid is designed to work with, that's the amount of data that you want to have on your state. Really no more, no less. I say no more. If you have a large amount of data and the grid wants, 10 records, maybe you have the full set of data on your state and then you just give it small pieces for pagination purposes. But whether you're storing, a million rows with NgRx and JavaScript, or a million rows with JavaScript and not having NgRx, it really doesn't make a difference. Ultimately, with NgRx, when it creates that state tree, it has a property to you, let's say the car data. Well, that car's property just points to an array on the heap. Whether that's a large array or a small array, that doesn't really impact NgRx at all. Now, what could be an issue is if you have the ability, if you're actually managing changes to that array, in terms of making a copy of that array and then adding a new car to it or something like that, that could be maybe a little bit of an issue in terms of that array being retained in memory, especially during debugging, because it keeps copies of the state tree. But in general, if your JavaScript can handle the amount of data that you're working with today, then NgRx really shouldn't have an issue with working with that same piece of data. Because at the end of the day, NgRx is really just more about a coding mechanism. It's not any more limited in terms of working with JavaScript memory than anything else is that you'd be coding with. All right, let's see here. Next question. Could I save the JSON file to a JSON database? So this JSON thing that I'm doing here with the JSON server, that's just a very simple node-based REST service for really doing development and stuff like that. Ultimately, you can use any data source, any data store with NgRx. NgRx doesn't really care what you're talking to in terms of storing the data out to a local REST service or contacting some type of cloud system, or whether it's going to be relational data, or whether it's going to be a document storage or a key value storage. none of that really matters as far as NgRx is concerned. So you could really store that information out anywhere you want to. The key to remembering the NgRx part is to keep in mind that whenever you are storing data to some type of external resource, it is an asynchronous operation. And because it's asynchronous, you have to use the effects module. There is no concept of doing asynchronous operations inside of a reducer. So if you're ever coding up a reducer for NgRx or for Redux, what have you, doesn't really matter. If you're ever coding up an actual reducer for that, and you start to put like REST service calls and stuff like that inside of it, then you're going to it's not going to that you'll be violating the rules of RxJS and Redux, or NgRx and Redux, which you can't do. All right, let's see here. All right, NgRx data pros and cons. So for the person who's asking that question, what specifically about NgRx data do you have a concern about? You can just chat a new question or chat into the chat box if you'd like. Are you just looking at it from the perspective of just managing your entity data, so on and so forth? I tend to not make use of the entity aspect of NgRx. The way that I manage my data now and the way that I interact with my remote services, I tend to go that route as opposed to bringing in the actual data part. So the thing is with me, I really view NgRx as a way of doing Redux with my Angular application. And so because I view it that way, when I look at NgRx, I really view it from just the standpoint of incorporating Redux into that app. I don't necessarily pull in extra things like working with the entities or data or stuff like that. It's just not my preference. I have other ways of managing that information. So my thoughts on the pros and cons would be, if you find that using the NgRx data works well for managing that entity data, then I think that it's fine to use. I don't, in my opinion, consider it to be a core part of what I'm trying to solve with Redux and managing my application state. I kind of view it as like a little bit of an add-on, and it's just an add-on that I choose to not use. So that would be my answer for that. If you've got some additional information you want to throw into the question box, I'm more than happy to answer that too. Oh, let's see here. It looks like we had a little extra information. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay, hiding too much. Okay. I can't really speak to the maturity of it, like I said, because I don't regularly really make use of it, but let's talk about the hiding too much part here a little bit real quick before we go. One of the goals of libraries and frameworks is to make it easier for people to get up and running, right? But the downside is that sometimes there's important behind the scenes information that we don't get access to. I'll give you a great example of this. The changes that came out in April for NgRx. Prior to the changes in April, when you worked with NgRx, it felt a lot more like standard Redux in terms of how you set up your actions and then how you would dispatch them and how you would build your reducers. What they did in the updates that were made was they created a way better API. I mean, it's so much easier to work with. It's a lot less coding, but because the way the API is set up, it would be possible for a new developer to NgRx to be a little bit confused, a little more than usual, about exactly what's going on and how it works. One of the things about Redux itself is that Redux can be challenging because of the overall pattern and all the files and stuff that are involved. But the actual coding that you see in Redux in many cases is very plain and very clear. However, because it's very plain and very clear, that usually means we also have a lot of boilerplate code, which once you understand how something works, the boilerplate code becomes very annoying. So with the new API in NgRx, it seems to me that if you know what's going on and you're building these applications, the new API is fantastic. But if you're learning this the first time, I think an argument could be made that the older approach, while more verbose and more boilerplate-ish, was actually probably a little bit more clear to the average JavaScript developer about what was really happening. Of course, we'll see over time as we continue to teach these newer versions, we'll see how students are receiving it and seeing over time if that's really a big deal. But I will say this: no matter what you're using, if you have the ability to know some more details about it and have a better understanding of it, that is always a good thing. Even if you don't use those details day to day, it helps you better understand exactly how the application's working, so on and so forth, which can aid in debugging and everything else. Okay, I think we have reached the end of our
Eric,
questions.
we have one last question.
Oh, yes.
Can you recommend a book?
On the NgRx stuff?
Yep.
It's with all the JavaScript stuff that we do, the best place to go for any of this information is always the website. So let me actually bring up the website here real quick. This right here is literally the single best place to go for any information related to NgRx. With Angular, it's the Angular website, React, the React website, Redux, the Redux website. The challenge is, in the modern JavaScript world, we get so many new things all the time. There are changes being constantly released. Almost any book in today's modern era is out of date the moment you print it. And so I always tell my students, while it's good to go maybe get a book on JavaScript or a book on C# or a book on Python for maybe the programming language itself, which doesn't change quite as much. When it comes to these UI libraries, it's really best just to master the documentation. Another good thing to check out are any blogs that are created by the people who actually create the library. So if you go out and search for a blog on NgRx, you'll find 10,000 of them out there on the web, and most of them are just repeating something that somebody else already said. But if you can get to the blogs for the people who actually created these things, a lot of times their blogs are going to have a unique insight, a unique take, or maybe communicate the intentions behind why something was created or how it's supposed to be used. And that's really the best place to go. In addition to the blogs and the documentation, you can also look for video tutorials. Now, videos are kind of like books; they can get out of date too. But videos can also be beneficial in terms of demonstrating things if things haven't gotten out of date over time. Okay, but that's really what I would recommend in terms of working with any of this stuff, is really reading the documentation. And what's really interesting about that? I'll teach my classes on these topics, and I'll ask the students in the class, either at the start of class or the end, how many people in the class have actually gone to the NgRx website and read the documentation? How many folks have gone to the Redux website and read the documentation? And it is almost zero every single time. And so you've got all of that free information out there. If you actually just go to the website and read it, it'll probably put you light years ahead of the rest of your development team, because a lot of folks don't reach out to the website. They go to Stack Overflow or they look for something else, but really the website is the place to go. Another cool thing I'll mention here on the NgRx website is they've got a really good getting started. And it's not just getting started with the store, it's getting started with the dev tools and effects and how to install them and test them and set them up. They've got a lot of great information. And this is always going to be updated. You can see here, this is where I grabbed the actual diagram from for this slide. So like we said, we'll push all the code up and then you can go back and check that out and then reach out to us if you have any questions or you're interested in any of the different offers that are available as part of the webinar here. So just as a quick reminder, you had the 10% discount on the public virtual mock courses, the Microsoft certification roles training, as well as a 10% discount on on-site training, and then an app dev cloud free briefing Q&A with the folks here at Wintellect. If you have an interest in any of those offers, please reach out to Martha. She'd be more than happy to help you with those. And here's our email, wintellectwebinarqa@wintellect.com. If you have any questions about anything that you saw here today, just reach out to us here and we'll be sure to get back to you. All right, I think that pretty much does it. I want to thank you all so much for taking time out of your day and for joining us for this. I know I went over by about 15 minutes, I apologize. But I do appreciate everyone being a part of this and for the great questions that you asked. I wish you guys all the best with your future programming endeavors, and don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions or need any help with anything. Thank you and take care.